This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us one of Macon, Georgia's most erudite, well-versed, genteel professors, Dr. Buck Melton.
I see my bribe worked yet again.
Welcome, Buck. And once again, we start this conversation, I bring up the fact that you've assuaged a political career and you've avoided going to Washington and are making, I know the country is crying out for people of your ilk, but do you have any regrets as we approach this situation?
None whatsoever.
Not a single one.
I'm sorry to sound callous, but that's just the way it is.
I guess we'll just have to accept that. Well, if we can move on, let's discuss something that I know we all think about a lot, and that's money. Money. And some of the issues that actually our country is dealing with now are tariffs. The role of tariffs could play in determining the world arrangement, economic arrangements. Could tariffs be a tremendous benefit to the United States, or would it be a bad thing? And maybe I could toss you the ball as an historian. What role have tariffs played in the United States, and particularly in its earlier days?
Well, tariffs have played a massive role that you really can't escape. They've not been much in the news lately, up until the federal income tax came in 1913, as a matter of fact. The tariff was really the principal revenue stream for the federal government. But quite apart from that, it was also a hot political topic as well as a hot economic topic. When we were colonies, of course, we were part of the British Empire when the theory of mercantilism and protectionism was really the dominant economic theory, the idea that there's only so much wealth in the world. That wealth is most easily measured in terms of precious metal, gold and silver, and that your country, your empire wants to have as much of that as possible. And so you would enact protectionist measures to try to discourage the flow of precious metal out to your competing empires.
Thus, the Corn Laws in Britain up until the 1840s, the barriers to trade that were erected, particularly in the United States. There was a lot of controversy because people that were farmers that lived in the South, they didn't like high tariffs. New England manufacturers were being benefited by that. So the ideas in the South, in any event, people were being taxed to support New England manufacturers. Lots of issues about that. So lots of tensions out there in regards to this. But then an extraordinary change took place in regards to the idea about free trade. So particularly in the 19th century in liberal circles, the idea was that you would have something called comparative advantage, and that a rising tide would lift all boats. And if I can just speak to that point, the idea would be that if you could manufacture shoes at half the price that someone else could do it, another country could, you can specialize in inexpensive shoes, and a country that could manufacture bird cages could do a much better job, and thus everyone would benefit. And the larger the free trade arrangements, the greater the economic prosperity of the country, as witnessed by the United States, which is an enormous free trade area, and it's a great, powerful advantage for the country. So is that a fair sort of taking it along those lines?
Yes, that was a good free trade apologia. When Smith comes in and Ricardo and other theorists who say it was really the precursor to internationalism in the economic sense, that national boundaries were in effect artificial things. And we ought to let, if you'll pardon the mixed metaphor, the invisible hand run trade just as much as it's running any other aspect of the economy. But I'm not sure. I mean, we're going
to take this. We'll sail the ship a bit here. Okay. I know you're going to have. You're not going to necessarily.
I've got to dip my oar in.
That rosy picture of free trade. Yes. Well, so things rolled along, And the idea appeared in the Depression. There was enormous problems in different countries, and the idea of balancing the budget was a big deal. And the way to protect one's resources would be to erect high trade barriers.
Here comes Smoot-Hawley.
And that's right. So allegedly, one of the most disastrous things that happened in the 1930s were countries tried to beggar their neighbor by putting large barriers up to prevent goods from coming into their country, protect their jobs, their economy, and trade wars occurred. So each country would try and build their fence higher and higher, and many economists would say that contributed enormously to the problems that happened in the 1930s.
Well, yes, I know some free trade adherents, and the Smoot-Hawley tariff came along in 1930. Just a few months after the stock market crash, which is the crash usually is taken as starting the Depression. And some free trade adherents I know say that if you look at economic activity, it was Smoot-Hawley that was really the thing that caused the cataclysm, that we could have recovered had it not been for that. Smoot-Hawley was an extremely high protective tariff, and there was a reciprocal reaction. The other countries raised trade barriers too and brought international trade to a grinding halt.
Well, bingo. And then we have Pearl Harbor, World War II. The Germans attack Poland. This terrible world cataclysm occurs. And then the idea is you have to get products as cheaply as you can make them. So you want a gun that is as cheap as you can make the gun because you don't have so much money. You have to get whatever you get wherever you can get it. And so the competing war economies did not particularly put trade barriers in there. People were trying to build nuclear weapons. They got whatever they could get as inexpensively as they could. And in the German world, there was sort of a pan-European economy there. Yes. The Germans didn't, although they extracted money from other places, the idea was they get things as cheaply as possible for the war economy. So things rolled along. We had this enormous, I guess, cataclysm, to use my word. The 1945 arrived, a new world dawned, and the idea was, at that point, the U.S. was on top of the mountain, if you could say that.
The American century.
Well, that's right. If you look at the gross national product the United States possessed in 1945, its percentage of world resources,
absolutely phenomenal.
All its intellectual capital.
Yes.
So it was the dominant alpha person, I use that word guardedly, on top of the mountain in 1945. And many countries were just bereft. They were in difficult circumstances. So as I understand it, the U.S. trade policy then hatched out to encourage allied countries to have arrangements with the U.S. So all kinds of preferential arrangements occurred. And if you're fighting the Soviet bloc, you want to be in the good guy corner, the U.S. would reward those sentiments with favorable trade arrangements. And contrary-wise, in the Soviet world, the idea was they put together enormous free trade areas, although not as successfully, to move products around. And these sort of gigantic mega economic spheres competed against each other.
Yes.
And it's okay, time rolls along. And then we, if I can just sail the ship a bit, it's the Berlin Wall comes down, the monolith crumbles, and the U.S. is once again in an extraordinarily dominant arrangement. I mean, it really is the victor of everywhere. So they won World War I, won World War II. The Soviet Union was smashed to smithereens. The wall came down. All these countries were just, in some ways, at America's feet at that point. And all the economic power resided in America. Everything was great. And one of the things that hashed out under these circumstances was the notion of free trade and sharing the wealth and letting American know-how, capital go to different countries without any restraint. Is that a fair?
Yes, and the idea of globalization at this point, the idea that trade, that transportation and communications had become so much more ubiquitous, so much cheaper, the idea of being able of an American corporation to being able to produce in a factory overseas was a lot more thinkable starting in the late 20th century than it had been 50 years earlier or 100 years earlier. And so the Republican Party, for instance, which had traditionally been high tariff to protect domestic American manufacturing, suddenly was getting on the free trade bandwagon as well. So your iPhone may be designed by engineers in Cupertino, California, but it now is built in China by Chinese labor, which is much less expensive than American labor, of course. So that helped contribute to this notion of free trade.
Well, so one of the things that happened was that everyone has access to the U.S. market, and there's free interchange of knowledge back and forth. So if you're, let's say you're in a country with no landline telephones, suddenly, and it costs a lot of money to put them there, suddenly you can just use cell phones. Suddenly things just flip in there. If you don't have, I don't know, it's very difficult, communication is difficult, it's hard to get around, suddenly the internet appears. And everyone has access to everything. So this tremendous change has occurred. And it's not so much that the U.S. has gone down, but everywhere else went up a lot, and they made use of a lot of the technology that had been put in place by the U.S., and they benefited enormously by access to the U.S. market, tremendous access. So just to discuss the comparative advantage under these circumstances, any country that had a large labor arrangement in producing a product could find cheaper labor than in the U.S. There are lots of reasons
Correct.
for that.
Yes.
So the U.S. The unions put
unions,
and,
occupational health and safety,
right, and also litigation. Minimum wage
Yes.
is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Also litigation. If you fall or you trip, you have to do something. Also,
benefits.
Product liability issues.
Mm-hmm.
If you manufacture something with the slightest thing that's off, it's a difficulty. You could say in medicine, FDA, whatever. So enormous regulations in the United States as sort of to protect the American citizen, and in some ways exalt the people that you could call working people. They're going to be in this circumstance. However, the government basically just opened the doors as best they could for products that were going to have a lot of labor content in them. And these products have come in enormously in the United States, particularly so referable to NAFTA, which we can sort of sail the ship into as we take our sort of lightning conversation through here.
Yes.
So the idea is you're going to have tremendous, huge economic zone, and those countries that have a large labor input into the product can send those products into the United States. And the result is going to be an enormous decrease in prices. So one reason that we haven't had inflation with the enormous deficit and everything else we have here is that those cheaper products are coming in. They're coming to wherever they go to, Walmart or Mercedes, as far as that goes. I don't know. So you have cheaper, more inexpensive products that have appeared, and they've, in many ways, marginalized a lot of labor-intensive occupations in the United States. Would that be a fair statement?
Oh, indeed. The idea of the Rust Belt, blue-collar America has been taking it on the chin for years now. There's not much sign of that turning around. But the idea is in compensation for that loss of jobs, the consumer has to spend less for day-to-day living.
And the other point is the government has, money has been generated in the United States, and the government has put in a very powerful safety net, or they've attempted to do that with a lot of income transference. Mm-hmm. So if it's not altogether, not an easy way to say it, but if you're in a coal miner in West Virginia, you work with your two hands, you earn money for your family. The coal mine closes. Well, the government's not going to let you. They're going to take care of you, and it's psychologically extremely debilitating. So one of the things going on with the people that propagated these policies is there was the psychological damage that took place to working America was just not particularly thought of. Is that a fair statement?
I think so. Or it was sort of a by the way thinking of that their jobs were just suddenly less important to corporate America. So,
and so just going out where we're actually in, a town that's off, not exactly in the middle of the, I don't know, the elite part of the universe, but we're in a nice town. And the idea is the people that are driving this, at least the idea out there on the street, would be the elite, the power brokers, the people that are making huge amounts of money, the people that are corporate heads,
yes,
are putting the factories somewhere else, and the American jobs are going away, and great amounts of money are being generated by this, by American capital harvesting the benefit.
Correct. That this whole arrangement benefits capital at the expense of labor.
And the labor gets a benefit from government subsidies.
Yes.
So that's sort of the way the circumstances have gone. And one of the things occurring is these other countries are just extraordinarily getting more and more powerful. Maybe that's an inevitable situation, but allowing American technology to be easily exported, not protecting intellectual property, the idea that the American advantage that traditionally the country's enjoyed has been extraordinarily diminished in the 21st century.
Yes. And I'm not sure free trade policy could touch all that. I mean, there are certain countries, China, for instance, has been notoriously uninterested in respecting or enforcing any kind of intellectual property rights. And there's not much you can do about that in the great scheme of things, unfortunately. Reverse engineering and industrial espionage, these things will happen.
And I mean, I don't think we should underestimate just the general merit of humans in other countries that have been in a social condition that sort of keeps them in a frozen position. They can't easily move around, can't do this, can't do that. Their culture just keeps them there. They have to sort of, I don't know, plow behind an oxen, and that's the life. Now, all kinds of possibilities are open. Aggressive, hardworking, intelligent people all around the world are in the middle of all this, and the U.S. population is only 5% of the world. So our power has been increasingly marginalized in the past decade or two. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, and I think there's no sign that this is going to change either. That's a matter that should be of great concern to all of us, but it just doesn't seem to be hitting on the radar.
And so finally, we get into our present set of circumstances as to what could tariffs at this stage of the game. What would be the benefit of is it too late? What would tariffs actually do? And is it a message to the people that set American trade policy that they've not paid enough attention to their constituents in the heartlands, and instead, and I think this is probably a reasonable thing to say, is people, let's say with Mexico, they might be very worried that social conditions there could have a negative impact on the U.S. if the place really imploded. And so just raising, no one would object to a country becoming more prosperous and doing better. And as they considered these situations, the American worker was not, the traditional worker was not the first thing on their minds. And they believed the system would work to everyone's advantage, in that everybody's situation would get better.
Once again, the rising tide lifting all boats.
That's right. So the idea is, and actually I think one could say that. I think there's argument along those lines that a huge world order in which free trade and people move across and move around, that probably would allow the world to be globally more prosperous. The species would do better and better if that could be accomplished. To do that, that would be great if it could happen. But we have national boundaries, do we not?
Well, we do. And once again, the true free trade internationalist approach would be to say these boundaries are largely illusory or at least irrelevant. And I'm not so sure about that. I think you could argue, in keeping to the metaphor, even if the tide is rising, there are eddies and currents, and some boats are going to be higher than other boats. So it's a matter of some economic interests advancing faster than other economic interests. And if you lose your job to a foreign factory, then the tide does not feel like it's coming in for you.
No, and I think you said something that I think we need to emphasize, is that the enormous conflict that's taking place in our planet the idea is, are national boundaries irrelevant? Do they matter? And if you go to a large metropolitan city, there are huge numbers of people from everywhere. Dozens of languages are used. People are going back and forth. People are traveling. They're communicating on the internet. They're watching 25 different, channels. They have every kind of access to everything. The planet is one big, huge planet, and it's like an exponential curve going up. And a lot of this sense of globalization is dependent on this free movement of resources around the planet. And in many ways, the idea that national boundaries are irrelevant, at least to some Western countries. Other countries, they're certainly not irrelevant. But particularly in the Western world, I think you could say that in many ways, and particularly in Europe. The Europeans have created this enormous 500 million people together, and the Europeans are sort of a role model that this is what globalization can do. We can everyone together, no more war, no more fighting, everyone will be happy.
And yet, Greece.
Yes.
I don't think you can say that national boundaries do not matter as long as nations themselves matter. Right now we're carrying a $20 trillion debt. And if the wheels come off in the United States, it will be the United States economic zone that is going to feel that far more than any other nation. And that's just the way it is.
So I think I just want to emphasize, this is the heart of the problem anyways, is each of the countries have their own national history, their own national identity. And the U.S. is a very unusual place. It's an exceptional place, American exceptionalism there. It's not like other countries. The idea is we can meld people into one sort of nation, and many people have great pride in that history, and yet I think the sense of marginalization and irrelevance is certainly out there. And then so President Donald Trump, in many ways, is in the White House because of the
nationalism.
And the disenchantment of many people with the political order that's hatched out in the country.
Yes.
And his idea would be to basically erect these barriers to help a chosen constituency.
Yes, and I think this is one of the reasons why Trump is anathema to a lot of the Republican leadership, because the traditional Republican leadership over the past 20 to 30 years has also become free trade. And now Trump shows up speaking like a protectionist, and that's not something they want to hear, because the tariffs that he's going to advocate putting on will be tariffs on American-owned industries that are producing overseas.
Now, I'm going to finally get to the point that I've been leading up to, and that is, in the new world out there, the idea of erecting these trade barriers it's not going to have the impact that planners would like it to have, because the horse has left the barn, so to speak. It's a whole nother deal out there. So the Chinese, with their 1.4 billion people, their extraordinary, all their advantages they have, they're going to things will be okay without the United States, as powerful as the country is. So our ability to play this card is not what it used to be, and it won't really turn the situation around, if I can phrase it that way. It may have some tactical advantages, but the last thing that the country would need, I believe, would be a terrible trade war, problems, our goods, and there are all kinds of reasons to think that these barriers that are imposed are taxes, and they will just ultimately injure the country, depending on how extensive they are. And also, there'll be groups of people or workers that are getting particular carrots, and others are not. So the idea is, well, we're going to protect steel workers, and in fact, that's going to injure people that work in automobile plants, and
yes.
On and on and on. So from a tactical point of view, you have that issue. Now, I think strategically, it's not going to work. Tactically, people would say, well, our trade arrangements could be negotiated in a better fashion. So if, in fact, these were sort of a bargaining chip that was being tossed in there for some kind of fairer situation, maybe that's not such a bad thing. Are your comments on that? I mean, are the Chinese going to repent in producing?
Not at all, not at all. And I think that it will cause, these new tariffs are going to cause some significant economic dislocations. The question I have is, over the long run, might it somehow re-stimulate American industry and cause us to rebuild some of the things that we have lost? Now, I don't think it could possibly do it in the short run. We'd have to have a long-term commitment to this and really rethink the model. But perhaps it could have a positive effect. I just don't know. I don't see it outlasting Trump, unfortunately, so I don't think we'd ever find out. I also think that a lot of the interests that I would have instinctively expected to applaud these new tariffs are saying, no, this is terrible. This is going to have to make us raise our own prices, and then we'll take a drubbing in the market because we'll be having to charge more. So I think the beer companies, because they make beer cans, for instance, the automobile industry with the extra costs for domestic steel. So I've been surprised at the almost universal condemnation of these tariffs, even from the sectors that I would have expected otherwise from.
Well, you could look at a lot of the free trade argument is out there, and you could say, well, the Chinese are producing too much steel because, despite their abilities, they're in this matter they're quite
dumping. I think
they're quite
it's pretty
stupid.
clear.
Well,
So,
they're quite stupid. So the idea is, well, we can produce whatever it is, 20 trillion tons of steel here, and we might even produce it at a loss. We can produce steel at a loss. Yes. But for our societal stability, we have to stabilize our society, and we're just going to give the Americans the benefit of our troubles and make sure that all the steel they have is free. So, if you're going to send, and the way they apparently get around this is this, and I think this is some of the conversation about NAFTA, is these products are shipped to Mexico and Canada, or maybe through several countries, and they're actually Chinese products that then get demarcated as Mexican arrangement, and then it's just sent in, yes. And it benefits the Mexicans or whatever country sends it in. There are lots of other countries that have free trade arrangements. Haiti might be one of them, but many goods are transshipped to these countries, yes, with favorable arrangements with us. The product comes in, and then we get the advantage. Now, one thing we haven't talked about is we're sort of getting low on time, is the balance of payments that with this situation has caused. So if you're in Washington and you're worried about geopolitical issues, you could say, well, if we can't produce tanks, we don't have the steel. There's no way for us to get the steel. We've given our national security to some other country, and additionally, when we get all these goods in and we don't send anything back, we owe the country money. So we owe the Chinese, whatever it is, $1 trillion.
We're back to mercantilism.
And then what the Chinese do is they buy the government's paper. So the Chinese have the ability, and many countries do, to basically sort of call the bonds in or stop buying.
Exactly. So
another thing that's going on here with this situation is we have this extraordinary national debt. Now, it's not as much as some countries, but it's an enormous debt, and the trade arrangements are impelling this national risk. So it's a substantial problem. Do you have some comments as we start to close our conversation?
It's something that I've worried about a great deal. That the huge leverage that China already has over us, buying our treasuries, and they could destroy us without firing a shot by calling or at least just not buying. And this keeps me up at nights worried. And there's no sign that anybody in Washington is worried about it with me. And I don't know.
So that's a long-term strategic issue,
yes,
but the tactical issue won't solve that. I mean, if we have sort of somehow the Chinese do a slightly better deal with us, that won't solve this enormous problem the country has in maintaining its financial and political stability.
Yes. Well, I remember about 30 years ago, A Japanese author wrote a book entitled The Japan That Can Say No, that is, no to the United States, because it now had enough economic clout to do that. We have clearly been in the era of the China that can say no for a couple of decades now, and it's only going to get worse.
Yes, it is. Well, Bucky, on those comments, thank you for being with
sir.
us tonight. Very erudite conversation as usual.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.